Don't look. Don't look. Have a guess. No. There is 10 chapters, and chapter 10 is very short. So we're slowly but surely, we worked our way through from verse 1 right through to nearly the end of the chapter. Now, I'm not getting to the end of the chapter tonight, but we've looked at the idea of what victims and victors are, and we've looked at the difference. And so many times, even in our society, there are so many people that consider themselves and allow themselves to be victims of their circumstances. And just in summary, a victim will blame others, whereas a victor will look after himself or herself. All a victim wants to hear is lies, while a victim wants to get to the truth. So these are showing the differences. A victim feels like they cannot succeed, while a victor feels they must succeed. A victim focuses on outward pressures, while a victor focuses on an inward confidence. A victim uses excuses to quit, while a victor finds ways to keep going. And if we looked at the Jewish situation and their circumstances, they could very well look at themselves as being victims. They've been oppressed, and Haman with his decree had decided they were going to wipe them out, and so they could have given up and says, "Woe is me, we have no future. Where is God? He's abandoned us. What are we going to do?" And they could have wallowed in their self-pity. But in these verses we see, well, I didn't put that one, but the first one should be the triumph achieved. Because it's a trap for many people to think of themselves as victims rather than realizing they can choose to remain as not being victors. They've got a choice to make. They don't have to stay that way. There are choices they can make. And often when trouble comes our way, what happens is we are forced to confront our problems. We are forced to deal with the pressures that continue to build in our lives. And sometimes there's situations and pressures that we cannot resolve. We just haven't got an answer for. We don't know what to do. And adversity, and by that I mean difficulties, I mean trials, I mean troubles, whatever you want to call them, they always get our attention, and we don't like them. And God brings them into our lives to get our attention. Here we are bubbling along, doing our own thing, not a problem, not a care in the world, all of a sudden, bang, there's something we don't like. And we complain about it. And it's certainly got our attention. And this is how God does it. He pulls us up. We stop what we're doing. We evaluate what is happening to us and why. And often, it's a challenge for us to think about our priorities. Where are we going? What are we doing? Why are we doing these things? And it becomes a reset to trust God more than what we've been doing. When troubles come our way, what it often does, it exposes our weaknesses and our failures. And it prompts us to let us know we're not in control, we're vulnerable, and we need to rely on God in ways we've never done before. And that doesn't happen until we find ourselves going through some trials and situations. As someone said, adversity is a classroom in life where we learn more about Christ and become more like him. Because there are situations and circumstances, no matter how well prepared we are, they're going to catch us unaware, and we cannot control them. And so when we've turned to God and we embrace his purposes through that things, we experience God's power working in and through us. But trials and troubles always challenge us to evaluate our priorities, to work out what is important in life. In our text, the Jewish people had thought of themselves as victims, without any options. That was until Mordecai and Esther came up and stepped up to the plate, gave them hope for the future. And so they started their journey to become victims rather than looking at themselves as victors. And we see this brought out, the ability. And with their swords, the Jewish people defeated all their enemies, killing and destroying them, and they did what they wanted with those people who hated them. Now, it would have come as a surprise to those who were intent on carrying out Haman's decree to be confronted by a large force of Jewish people, a force that was prepared to defend themselves. It would have been a shock. They felt it was going to be a walkover. And, here they meet a people that are not going to be a walkover, that are not going to be stepped on. They were ready to defend themselves. Now, what surprised this opposition was the ability of the Jewish people to anticipate the strategies that were going to be used on them and then turn them around and use them against the very people that were opposing them. Now, on that day, as we have the foresight of Scripture, the battle was one-sided. No matter what this opposition, meaning the rest of the Persian people who decided to wipe out the Jewish people, no matter what they tried to do, the Jewish people were prepared, they were ready and waiting, and they were totally in control of everything on that day. You have those good days where you can't do anything wrong, nothing seems to go wrong, and you've got to marvel and say, why can't I have more days like this where everything is wonderful, everything works out just the way I thought it would? Well, for the opposition, everything they did didn't work out. To the enemy, this was supposed to be their day, this was supposed to be their moment of glory, and everything they did went by the wayside. And the reports began to come in that everywhere the Jewish people had assembled themselves to protect themselves against this opposition, they were victorious. So they became victors rather than victims. And the interesting thing I find, their enemies had no answers for what they encountered. No matter what they tried, they didn't know what to do. Didn't know whether they went left, right, or whatever. Everything ended in defeat. Now, if we remember back to the early part of Esther, Haman had been a superstitious man. And what had he done? To find out what the right day was, what did he do? Can you remember? Did he just go, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, that is the day to go? What did he do? You see, he wanted to make sure that this was the right day that the gods had chosen. So we find he rolled the dice to find that this was the exact month, the exact day, and it was assigned to him. This was what was going to give him success, the most success against the Jewish people. So he'd carefully selected this date and this day, and it was wrong. Because no matter what happened, whatever his gods had said, his followers defeated. So all these carefully laid plans of a superstitious man came to nothing. So the people had the ability to defend themselves, and they were prepared. And that's a lesson for us as well. God expects us to assemble and be together because one person hasn't got all the answers. But collectively, there is a lot of wisdom among many of God's people that can unite against a common foe. So There's that adage, safety in numbers, but they were well prepared for the enemy. If there had only been one or two, they would have easily been picked off. But when they're combined together, and as I've said previously, there were 15 million Jews throughout the 127 provinces. They gathered together on that day, prepared to defend themselves. The enemy wasn't expecting a united front from a people that were prepared to battle and defend themselves. We see the abundance in, don't know what's happening here. I've missed out part. It's the abundance here. In the palace of Susa, they killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Pashadatha, Dalphon, Aspathar, Poratha, Adalia, Aradatha, Parmashata, Arisa, Arida, and Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedath, the enemy of the Jewish people. And it's interesting. These verses tell us that everywhere the Jewish people were confronted by opposition, they won. They defeated their enemies. And it seems that the palace and the city of Susa, where the palace was situated, had a large contingent of Persian citizens who decided it was worthwhile to get themselves involved, accept Haman's decree, and wipe the Jewish people out. Now, our texts indicate that at least 500 men were killed. So it's reasonable to expect that's 500 men that were killed, but there were far more numbers that were engaged in the conflict. But it was 500 men who didn't make it home that night. And there would have been no conflict in the palace, as this would have been off limits. But everywhere else in the city, around the palace, the gloves were off. In Susa, everybody who felt they wanted to be part of it, the Jews were fair game. Now, it's strange that in Susa, this is where the king lived and worked. This is where the king made it known he favoured the Jews. He put his seal on the second decree from Mordecai. And yet, over 500 of his prominent citizens were prepared to oppose the Jews, even if that meant incurring Xerxes' wrath for doing it. Now, keep in mind that in Mordecai's decree, the Jewish people were only allowed to defend themselves when they were opposed. They couldn't take the offensive action and go after them. They were given permission only to defend themselves if they were attacked. And what we're told, 500 of the Persian citizens didn't make it home that day. At least 500 of them ended up being dead. So it seems that the hatred the Amalekites had for the Jews knew no bounds. It had festered and continued for decades, and when the day came, it was an opportunity, if you like, to get even, to square up accounts. It was a matter of kill or be killed in the palace. It didn't matter one iota. The king had given the green light to both groups through the issuing of these two edicts. Justice would be done that day when the prophecy against Amalek would be fulfilled through the events that have transpired throughout this whole book of Esther. In other words, when these two sides met, no quarter was asked or given by both sides. But for those who oppressed the Jewish people, their time was up. They paid the ultimate price for their hatred, with many dying on that day. The tragedy is there's a whole family involved that's wiped out. Our text mentioned 10 names. Those 10 names identified as coming from Haman's family, all of Persian origin. Now, it's interesting that I find each one of the sons' names is written below each other in a vertical line to indicate they were hung on one pole, one above each other at fixed intervals. Now that's interesting, because when we say they were hung, we have this idea they were hung by the neck and swinging in the breeze. But it wasn't so. How big was the pole that Haman had built? Anyone remember? It was 75 feet high. So if you look at 75 feet high, it was big enough to be able to put the bodies of Haman's son, starting from the top, one after another, with a little space in between. 75 feet is a long pole. And so it's not being hung by the neck, it's actually being, if you like, I won't say drilled, but you're stuck on this pole and your body is impaled on it. So you've got 10 bodies with these inscriptions all the way up. So it's not an easy thing, but this is the idea behind why it's in a vertical line. So it actually gives credence to Haman's gallows, and all 10 of them were hung in this way. Lest there is cause for misunderstanding who these men are, our text points out the connection to Haman and to his father Hammedatha, and they are called the enemy of the Jews. Maybe they all decided to take their revenge out on the Jews for what happened to their father Haman. Only problem was they experienced a serious setback and defeat because they paid for their actions with their lives. The abstinence, but the Jewish people did not take their belongings. Now, I find that fascinating, because in Haman's decree, it meant that they could kill the Jews and take their property and their possessions. In the second decree that was given, the Jewish people were given the right to do exactly the same. But they chose not to take any property or possessions, yet they had the right. They chose not to. So what does that tell me about the Jewish people's motivation? It tells me one reason. They didn't gather together for the reason to gather other people's riches. They gathered together for self-preservation. It was never about profit. It was never about plunder. It was about protecting themselves from their aggressors, those people who were intent on taking their lives. So their conscience was clear. Their motives were right, and no one could accuse them of profiting from the events that occurred. They were not interested in accumulating wealth at the expense of the people they had defeated. For them, life was a priority. It was not about material wealth and gain. And it was a positive witness to the rest of the Persian community. They only defended themselves from annihilation, which, if you think about it, was what ordinary citizens themselves would have done if the shoe had been on the other foot. They would have defended themselves. Now the challenge is for us as modern day believers is to maintain a faithful witness and do nothing that would destroy or tear down that testimony. And there are many things we can do, if you like, that are lawful. But our priority is always to seek the Lord and honour Him in our actions. And we do it not looking for material benefits or gain that, well, might please us, but in so doing them, we might lose our witness. God has His hand on His people, and He's working things out on their behalf in the best way, to honour them and to bring glory to His name. There will be times in life where we'll face difficult situations that are beyond our control. But the beauty is we know the one who controls those circumstances. We know he can choose to intervene and provide us with what we need when the time comes. And things can sometimes look very bleak, and we can only see defeat before us. But often that's not on the Lord's agenda. He always honours those who honour him, and will bring victory over those circumstances if we remain true and loyal to him. In these last verses, we have the tribute acknowledged in verses 11 to 14. We find in our text that Xerxes was informed of all those killed around the palace in Susa. And I guess as king, he would have found the numbers distressing, because he realised that, hey, in the palace, there were many enemies. There was much political innuendos and undercurrents that had been running against the Jewish people. And I have no doubt he was kept abreast of the number of Persians that had been involved in this encounter, and he wouldn't have been overly surprised to see the involvement and to understand that the possible leaders of the events were Haman's 10 sons, who he could understand wanted revenge and payback for what had happened to their father. But our text also shows that Xerxes must have marvelled at the courage of Esther, who motivated and moved her people to face such opposition. And he acknowledges her by granting her request. And remember, this is Esther's request to take the 10 bodies and hang them one after another in a public message to any other enemies who were thinking of doing something similar. It was going to cost you your life. It would bring shame and dishonour upon their family name as a lasting legacy. The account on that day, the number killed in the palace at Susa was reported to the king. Now, it seems strange that Xerxes, as the king, would let this go on. But he was interested enough to understand and want to know the numbers that were killed around the palace, because this is where the seat of the Persian government lay. And he had delegated to the Persian public service, those in charge, he wanted constant updates of the casualties as they grew. Now, if I'm a public servant, I would be a little concerned here, because how would you go about finding the numbers of the people dead in a constant, updated way? You know, we have television reporters with their cameras and their microphones, and they're observing from afar and giving us the numbers and the updates. They didn't have that in those days. So how would they know? You would have to be on the ground. Now, whether that would mean you're counting the bodies, you have to be in the action or someone close to it to be able to provide constant updates to the king of the number of people dying that were Persian people. And remembering there was 500 of them that were killed, and you've got to make an update. And I can only imagine the turmoil and the conflict as the king is listening to these updated reports. You know, here were his own countrymen prepared to raise a hand against his queen. You know, how could they do that? He didn't understand. Because, in effect, if they were ready to raise their hand against the queen, they were opposing him as the king. That's how he saw it. How can his countrymen do this? As a king, though, he understood this internal war was happening, and he was concerned about the numbers of his citizens involved in the battle, how many of them being killed. But at the same time, it revealed to him the animosity that had been current in the palace. There were many people. he understood, were dissatisfied with the Jewish people. This was a way to ferret them out and see how deep it ran in the political system of Persia. He understood he needed to make further changes and corrections to make sure it didn't happen again. So he's a bit in a meat in the sandwich in many respects. I find it interesting that only the Persian casualties recorded by the king. He didn't want to know about how many Jewish people were killed. We're not given that. But he wanted to know how many Persian citizens were killed. Did that mean that no Jewish people were killed? No. I think Xerxes' motivation was to know how many people were involved in this uprising from among those he trusted in the palace. That was his motivation. The appeal, the king said to Queen Esther, the Jewish people have killed and destroyed 500 people in the palace at Susa. They've also killed Haman's 10 sons. What have they done in the rest of the king's empire? Now, what else are you asking? I will do it. What else do you want? It will be done. So, the king is updated on all the casualties that had happened. But he had no idea and size of what was happening in the rest of his 127 provinces. There's 500 that are dead in Susa, the capital. Now, in his mind, he can only guess and wonder at how many people were dying. If there were 500 that had been identified in Susa, and you applied that same number throughout the 127 provinces that stretch from India to Ethiopia, how many people would that mean? Is there anyone here who's good with maths? 500 times 127, what do you get? See, we need a calculator, don't we? It would be around 63,500 of his countrymen had perished, and he would have to wait weeks for the final confirmation. But if you took 500 happening in one province, multiplied that across the 127 provinces, you came up with 63,500 of his countrymen dead. There was probably more. Now that is quite an uprising. The king's statement of acknowledgement that the Jewish people had been successful in defending themselves is shown in the number of people killed. Maybe he's pondering this question in allowing Esther, for Esther's benefit, to digest. Well, you Jewish people, you've accomplished what you wanted. What else do you want? In other words, I want you to think about the magnitude, the scope of how many people have been killed in this uprising, this slaughter. And yet he says this, what else do you require? Tell me, and I'll give it to you. He reminds her he's given her all that she had hoped and asked for and wants to please her. Now, why on earth would you do that? And I think by human nature, I think Xerxes is on a guilt trip here, and he wants to curry favour with her for the right reasons. You see, he had been conned by Haman in the first place, and he was just as responsible for the slaughter of his own people because of his stupidity, and now he wants to make things right. But he's not going to come out and say, hey, look, I screwed up, I got it wrong, I'm sorry. Maybe it hit him hard that he could have lost her because he was responsible for passing this law in the first place without understanding the consequences of what he signed. Now, it's interesting to note that when Esther wanted to visit the king, he gave her mercy by extending the scepter in 2 occasions. But here he extends grace and favour. There's no thought of retribution or consequences. It's giving a favour to her. I know we're getting close. I'll finish there. Whoops. Esther answered, if it pleases the king, give the Jewish people who are in Susa permission to do it again tomorrow what the king ordered for today, and let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the platform. So the king ordered that it be done. A law was given in Susa. The bodies of the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. Now, if you were given an opportunity to ask for what you want, why on earth would you ask for 10 dead bodies? Is there something wrong with Esther's thinking? To ask for these 10 bodies? And many people, some scholars, find it hard to imagine a woman having such an attitude and desire for violence within her. Haman's 10 sons had been killed in the slaughter at Susa. They were already dead. And Esther's request is that they be allowed to take those 10 bodies, hang them up one under another as a warning to others who thought to do ill to the Jewish people. And it makes sense. Esther and the Jewish people had been threatened with extermination by Haman. In his power of influence, he left no stone unturned in accomplishing his quest. Exterminate them completely. He had been allowed his hatred to influence and permeate his whole family. It destroyed Haman's life, and now his sons were the recipients of that hatred. They paid with their lives. Those who had been associated with this plan had revelled in the opportunity when the day came to be part of that process to exterminate the Jews from among them while adding to their own wealth and possessions. Mordecai's new law had put a spoke in their plans and ambitions. Many were left feeling frustrated and unsure of themselves, with some withdrawing from involving themselves as victory was uncertain. Whereas when Haman is at the centre of power, they were assured. These same people who had openly taunted most of the Jewish people, who had sought to kill them, were now in hiding on the day of slaughter. Now that the danger was past, they had survived. They had taken up their normal lives, still hating the Jews and waiting for another day of revenge. So Esther's asked the king to grant an extra day for the Jewish people to continue what had been started on the previous day, to flush out those who had hidden themselves away so they could be found and dealt with in the same way they wanted to kill the Jewish people. In this new edict, it would have been so easy for people who had not even been aware that Mordecai had written a new one. The ink had hardly been time to dry before it was out. And so, in other words, if these people had resumed their normal days and the king had said, yes, you can have an extra day to flush them out, the ink wouldn't have had time to dry on the paper before they were starting to do it. These people had no opportunity to escape what was coming. The strategy of hanging the 10 bodies of their enemy was sending a clear message to both Jews and Persians who would understand the significance of this act. For the Jewish people, it was known that hanging a person on a tree was a sign or a curse, and that comes from Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23. If a person commits a sin punishable by death and is executed, you hang the corpse on a tree. His body must not remain all night on the tree. Instead, you must make certain you bury him that same day. For the one who is left exposed on a tree is cursed by God. You must not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So the law of removing the body from a tree only applied within Israel, their inherited land. The law says nothing of taking them down outside the land. So they may have hung there one day or until they were nothing but bones. However, their hanging would be a sign to the Jews of the curse upon their enemies. It would be a sign to all others of the disgrace and the terror which would be meted out as punishment against those offenders in the future. So we find that Xerxes granted this amendment. The victory over the foes of the Jews, particularly the Amalekites, would be effective, and their disgrace would be seen by all. Now, it's a challenge for us today as we close to remember you and I don't live our lives in a bubble. Now, I remember in COVID, remember the COVID bubbles that the AFL and the NRL, they had bubbles. You're not allowed inside or outside those bubbles unless you observe certain restrictions and qualifications. Well, as Christians, we don't live in a bubble. We're not immune from the world. What we do and what we say in word or deed has far-reaching consequences. We cannot be blamed or judged by God because of the actions of another person, but often, in the case, we deal with the consequences of another person's sin. Haman's sons. There are many families today who are living with sinful consequences or actions of one family member who has brought shame and disgrace upon their family because of what they've done. Haman didn't understand how far his hatred had gone. He allowed it to colour his perspective and that of his family when it came to the Jewish people. They suffered the legacy of public shame and infamy of being cursed by God. And it's better to be on the side of blessing and seeking God's favour than to have a personal vendetta that we may have against another person will not win. But the Jewish people became victors on that day. God had allowed this second decree to take place, and they were able to overcome the opposition and their enemies. But they were on the same page. They were prepared. They had the ability not to take the offensive, but simply defend themselves. And I believe in the days that lie ahead, as Christians, we need to be together. We need to be on the same page. We need to trust the Lord. We don't have to take the offensive and go after them. We just need to have the tools and be prepared and be aware of the strategies that the enemy uses. And when he comes against us, those strategies will be rebuffed if we are prepared and on the same page together. And that's the challenge. We don't